The morning sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains when Sheriff Thomas Mackenzie felt the first tremor beneath his boots. Not an earthquake this time, but something else entirely, something that made his weathered hands instinctively drift toward the worn grip of his Colt .45. The ground vibrated with a rhythmic pounding, like thunder rolling across the desert floor, yet the October sky stretched clear and merciless overhead. "Tom, you hearing that?" Deputy Miguel Rodriguez reined in his sorrel gelding, dark eyes scanning the boulder-strewn landscape that had been forever changed by the great earthquake just months before. Massive rocks the size of stagecoaches now dotted the canyon floor where once smooth pathways had guided travelers through the treacherous terrain. The Sonora earthquake had not only rearranged the physical world but had driven wildlife from their familiar territories, creating an unpredictable and dangerous environment for anyone brave enough to venture into these remote reaches of Arizona territory. Mackenzie dismounted, his 52-year-old frame still carrying the disciplined posture of his cavalry days, though 17 years of sheriffing in this unforgiving territory had etched deep lines around his steel-gray eyes. He pressed his ear to a sun-baked boulder, feeling the vibrations travel through the stone like a message written in a language only the desert understood. The sound was getting closer, accompanied now by something that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable scream of a horse in mortal terror. "That ain't no Mustang," Miguel said, swinging down from his saddle with the fluid grace that came from 33 years of working cattle before he'd pinned on a deputy's badge. His calloused hand moved to the Winchester rifle secured in his saddle scabbard, though he didn't draw it yet. Both men had learned that in this country, survival often depended more on patience and observation than on quick draws and blazing guns. "Sounds like a mare, and she's in a powerful fix." The screaming continued, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that seemed to amplify not just the sound but the desperation behind it. Mackenzie had heard horses cry out before, during his years fighting Apache raiders and cattle rustlers, but this was different. This was the sound of an animal facing death and knowing it, the kind of primal fear that cut straight through a man's civilized pretenses and reminded him that nature's cruelest predators didn't always walk on two legs. "We got to move careful, Miguel. That earthquake shifted everything around here. Half the old trails are gone, and the other half lead straight into dead-end canyons." Mackenzie checked his rifle, a habit ingrained through decades of frontier law enforcement where preparation often meant the difference between going home to supper and being buried in an unmarked grave. Besides, whatever's got that horse spooked is big enough to make the ground shake under our feet. They led their horses toward the sound, following a narrow game trail that wound between towering sandstone formations painted in shades of red and gold by millions of years of wind and weather. The earthquake had cracked some of these ancient walls, creating new passages while sealing off others, and Mackenzie couldn't shake the feeling that they were entering a landscape that no white man had ever seen before. The very rock seemed to watch them with the patient malevolence of something that had witnessed countless human dramas play out across its face, most ending in failure and bones bleached white by the desert sun. As they climbed higher, following switchbacks that seemed to lead nowhere but up, the horse's screaming grew more distinct, more desperate. It was definitely a mare, her voice cracking with exhaustion, and underneath it they could hear something else, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Miguel crossed himself quietly, a gesture learned at his grandmother's knee in the adobe churches of Old Mexico, where saints and devils still walked among mortal men and the line between the natural and supernatural remained forever blurred. "Madre de Dios," he whispered, "that's no ordinary bear." The growling grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like massive claws raking across stone, carving gouges in rock that had stood unchanged since before the first Apache had painted their faces for war. Mackenzie felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill, remembering stories told by old-timers around campfires, tales of giant grizzlies driven mad by prospectors' dynamite, of bears so large they could drag a full-grown steer up the side of a mountain and so cunning they seemed to understand human speech. The trail suddenly opened into a natural amphitheater, a circular depression in the rock perhaps 200 yards across, with walls rising sheer on three sides and only the narrow path they'd followed providing any means of escape. In the center of this stone arena, perched on a ledge barely wide enough to hold her, stood the most beautiful mare Mackenzie had ever seen. Her coat gleamed like spun gold in the morning light, and her sides were swollen with the promise of new life, marking her as heavy with foal and perhaps only days away from giving birth. But it wasn't the mare's beauty that froze both lawmen in their tracks. It was what stood between her and freedom, blocking the only path down from her precarious refuge. The bear was unlike anything either man had ever encountered, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs to test the wind for scent. Its massive head swayed back and forth with predatory intelligence, while claws longer than bowie knives scraped furrows in the solid rock as it paced. The creature's dark brown fur was matted with scars from old battles, and its small black eyes held a malevolent cunning that seemed almost human in its calculation. Sweet Jesus, Mackenzie breathed, understanding immediately why the earthquake-displaced beast had chosen this particular location for its territorial stand. The narrow ledge made escape impossible for the mare, while the circular walls would amplify sound and scent, allowing the bear to detect any approaching threat long before it could pose real danger. This wasn't just predatory behavior, it was strategic thinking of the highest order. Miguel pointed toward the mare's swollen belly, noting how she favored her left rear leg, probably injured in whatever desperate flight had brought her to this trap. She's gonna drop that foal any day now, Tom. Maybe even today, by the look of her. If that bear gets up there. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both men had seen what grizzlies could do to livestock, and neither wanted to imagine such violence visited upon a creature so close to bringing new life into the world. The bear seemed to sense their presence even though they'd taken cover behind a cluster of fallen boulders, its massive head turning in their direction with unsettling directness. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and lawman regarded each other across the blood-red stone of the ancient amphitheater. Then the giant grizzly dropped to all fours and began moving toward their position with a fluid, rolling gait that covered ground with deceptive speed. "He's coming our way," Miguel said quietly, checking his rifle action with the practiced calm of a man who'd faced death before and expected to face it again. "That son of a bitch knows we're here." Mackenzie studied the approaching bear with the analytical mind that had kept him alive through 2 decades of frontier law enforcement. The creature moved with purpose, but not the blind rage of a wounded animal or the desperate hunger of a starving predator. This was controlled aggression, the calculated advance of an apex predator defending what it had decided was its territory. The earthquake had displaced more than just rocks and trees, it had forced ancient hierarchies to reform, and this particular grizzly had apparently decided that everything within these canyon walls now belonged to him. "We can't just ride away," Mackenzie said, though every instinct developed through years of survival in hostile territory screamed at him to retreat. "That mare's somebody's property, probably worth more than either of us makes in 6 months. And she's carrying a foal that might be worth even more." "Property hell," Miguel replied, his dark eyes never leaving the advancing bear. "Look at her, Tom. Really look at her. That's no ordinary ranch horse. See how she holds herself, even scared as she is? See the way her head's shaped, the arch of her neck? That's Arabian blood, maybe Spanish barb mixed in. Somebody brought her west for breeding, paid serious money for the privilege." The bear stopped perhaps 50 yards away, rising again to its full height and testing the air with obvious intelligence. Mackenzie realized with growing unease that the creature was actually studying them, evaluating their weapons, their positions, their probable intentions. Most bears, even grizzlies, would either charge immediately or retreat when faced with armed humans. This one seemed to be developing a tactical assessment of the situation. "There's something else, Miguel," Mackenzie said slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "Think about what we haven't seen on our patrol this morning. No cattle tracks, no sign of the Bartlett Ranch hands, no indication that anybody's been through here since the earthquake. But that mare didn't get up on that ledge by herself, not carrying a foal and with a bad leg. You thinking somebody drove her up there? Used her as bait?" Miguel's voice carried the edge that came when violence was about to erupt, when men had to choose between retreat and blood. That would mean we're not just dealing with a displaced bear and a trapped horse," Mackenzie finished. "That would mean somebody wanted us to find this exact situation, in this exact place, at this exact time." The implications hung in the air like gun smoke, heavy with possibility and danger. If someone had orchestrated this confrontation, then every move from this point forward was potentially part of a larger game whose rules and objectives remained hidden. The bear continued its patient evaluation, while somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the wind, came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, too many hoofbeats to represent any innocent traveling party. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive jingle of spurs and the creaking of leather that marked experienced riders pushing their mounts hard across difficult terrain. Mackenzie counted at least 4 horses, maybe 5, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military training or outlaw experience. The bear seemed to sense the approaching riders as well, its massive head swiveling toward the sound while maintaining its watchful stance between the trapped mare and any potential rescue. "Miguel, we need to get to higher ground," Mackenzie whispered, gesturing toward a cluster of boulders that would provide both cover and a clear field of fire. "If this is what I think it is, we're about to be caught in the middle of something that's got nothing to do with that bear and everything to do with why somebody wanted us here." As they moved carefully through the scattered rocks, keeping low to avoid detection, the first rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Even at a distance, Mackenzie recognized the distinctive silhouette of Jebediah Crane, a man who'd been walking the thin line between legitimate business and outright criminality for as long as anyone could remember. Crane owned several properties along the Mexican border, officially dealing in cattle and mining claims, but rumors persisted about his involvement in everything from gun running to slave trading. Behind him rode 3 men Mackenzie didn't recognize, but their bearing and the way they carried their weapons marked them as professionals. "Well, well," Crane called out as his horse pranced nervously at the edge of the natural amphitheater, clearly disturbed by the scent of the giant bear. "Sheriff Mackenzie and his faithful deputy, right on time. I do so appreciate punctuality in law enforcement." The bear had shifted its attention to the new arrivals, rising to its full height and producing a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the canyon walls. Crane's horse reared, nearly unseating its rider, while the other mounts showed various degrees of panic at the proximity of such a massive predator. Only years of experience with spooked horses kept all 4 riders in their saddles, but Mackenzie could see the sweat beading on their faces despite the morning chill. "Crane," Mackenzie called back, keeping his rifle ready but not yet aimed. "That's quite a pet you've got yourself there. Mind explaining how you managed to train a grizzly bear to hold a pregnant mare hostage?" "Train?" Crane laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine mirth. "Sheriff, you give me far too much credit. Nature provided the bear, and the earthquake provided the perfect trap. All I had to do was drive the mare up here and wait for the inevitable result. Bears are remarkably predictable creatures when it comes to defending territory, especially when they've been displaced by geological events." Miguel had worked his way around to a flanking position, using the scattered boulders for cover, and Mackenzie could see him drawing a bead on one of Crane's companions. The deputy's military experience in the Apache campaigns had taught him the value of crossfire, and Mackenzie felt a moment of professional satisfaction at his partner's tactical thinking. "So this whole thing was a setup," Mackenzie said, loud enough for his voice to carry clearly across the stone amphitheater. "But I'm having trouble understanding the why of it, Crane. You went to considerable trouble and expense to arrange this little meeting. What exactly do you want?" One of Crane's men, a lean individual with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, leaned over to whisper something in his employer's ear. Mackenzie caught only fragments of the conversation, but the words he could make out chilled his blood: railroad survey, mineral rights, and most disturbing of all, permanent solution. The mare chose that moment to let out another desperate whinny, her sides heaving with the effort of supporting her unborn foal while maintaining her precarious balance on the narrow ledge. The sound seemed to infuriate the bear, which dropped to all 4s and began pacing in tight circles, its massive claws gouging deeper furrows in the solid rock with each step. Mackenzie realized with growing alarm that the creature was working itself into a killing frenzy, and if something didn't happen soon, both mare and foal would be lost. "The railroad's coming through, Sheriff," Crane continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Southern Pacific's already completed their survey, and they're planning to run a spur line right through this canyon. Problem is, certain local law enforcement officials have been asking too many questions about land ownership and mineral rights in areas where such questions are distinctly unwelcome. So you decided to arrange a little accident," Miguel called out from his concealed position, his rifle now clearly visible and aimed at Crane's chest. "Make it look like the famous Sheriff Mackenzie died heroically trying to save a horse from a bear attack. Very poetic, very believable," and very convenient for whoever's been buying up land through dummy corporations. Crane's face darkened at the sound of Miguel's voice, and Mackenzie saw the man's hand drift toward the pistol at his hip. Deputy Rodriguez, you always were too smart for your own good. Yes, it would have been a beautiful story. Two brave lawmen, killed by a giant bear while attempting to rescue a valuable broodmare. The newspapers would have loved it, especially the part about the pregnant horse. Very touching, very heroic. Except we're not cooperating with your little drama, Mackenzie said, using the conversation to work his way closer to a position where he could get a clear shot at the bear. If they were going to survive this encounter, their first priority had to be eliminating the immediate threat, and then they could deal with Crane and his hired guns. The bear had stopped pacing and was now staring directly at Mackenzie with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. For a moment, man and predator regarded each other across the blood-red stone of the ancient amphitheater, each evaluating the other's capabilities and intentions. Then, without warning, the massive creature began climbing toward the ledge where the mare waited in trembling terror. Now would be a good time, Sheriff, Crane called out mockingly. Your precious horse is about to become bear food, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Unless, of course, you'd like to surrender your weapons and come down here for a civilized discussion about your future employment prospects. Mackenzie ignored the taunting voice and focused entirely on the climbing bear. The creature was moving with surprising agility for something of its size, using claws and sheer strength to navigate what appeared to be an impossible vertical ascent. In perhaps 30 seconds, it would reach the mare, and then the real horror would begin. Miguel, Mackenzie called out quietly, knowing his deputy would hear him despite the distance. On my count, we take the bear together. Center mass, keep firing until it stops moving. Forget about Crane and his boys for now. Understood, came the reply, barely audible above the sound of the bear's claws scraping against stone. Mackenzie drew a deep breath, let half of it out, and settled his rifle's sights on the massive target. The bear was perhaps 20 feet below the mare now, close enough that Mackenzie could see the individual scars crisscrossing its hide, evidence of a lifetime spent in violent encounters with everything from rival bears to armed humans. This was not an animal that would be easily discouraged or quickly killed. Now, Mackenzie called out, and both rifles spoke almost simultaneously. The heavy bullets struck the bear in rapid succession, one in the shoulder and one in the ribs, but instead of dropping the creature, the shots only seemed to enrage it further. The bear roared again, a sound of pure fury and pain, and began climbing faster, driven by the kind of primal rage that made wounded grizzlies legendary among frontier hunters. Blood began flowing from its wounds, but not enough to slow its relentless progress toward the trapped mare. Keep shooting, Mackenzie shouted, working the lever action of his Winchester as fast as his fingers could manage. It's going to take everything we've got to stop that thing. More shots rang out, some from Mackenzie and Miguel, others from Crane's men who had apparently decided that a rampaging grizzly bear posed a more immediate threat than any tactical advantages they might gain from the situation. The bear was hit repeatedly, each bullet impact marked by a spray of blood and fur, but the massive creature continued its climb with single-minded determination. The mare was screaming continuously now, a sound of pure terror that seemed to echo off the canyon walls and multiply until the entire world seemed filled with the sound of approaching death. Her sides were heaving not just with fear but with what Mackenzie suddenly realized were labor contractions. The stress of the situation was triggering premature birth, and if they didn't act immediately, they would lose both mother and foal. That's it, Mackenzie said to himself, making a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over 2 decades of law enforcement. Standing up from his concealed position, he began running directly toward the climbing bear, lever-working his rifle and firing as fast as he could manage accurate shots. Tom, what the hell are you doing? Miguel shouted, but Mackenzie was beyond hearing anything except the sound of his own breathing and the mechanical action of his rifle. He had entered that strange state of clarity that sometimes comes to men in mortal combat, where time seems to slow and every detail becomes preternaturally sharp. The bear saw him coming and abandoned its climb, dropping back to the canyon floor with surprising grace for such a massive creature. It landed perhaps 50 feet from Mackenzie and immediately charged, moving with the fluid power of an avalanche given life and purpose. Mackenzie continued firing, his bullets striking the creature's chest and head, but the bear showed no sign of slowing. At the last possible moment, when the bear was close enough that Mackenzie could smell its breath and see the rage burning in its small black eyes, the massive creature stumbled. The accumulated damage from multiple rifle shots had finally begun to take its toll, and the bear's charge became an uncontrolled tumble that carried it past Mackenzie and into a cluster of sharp-edged boulders. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against Mackenzie's eardrums like a physical force. Even the mare had stopped screaming, though whether from relief or exhaustion he couldn't tell. Then, from somewhere among the rocks where the bear had fallen, came a low whimpering sound that somehow seemed more pathetic than terrifying. "Is it dead?" Miguel called out, emerging from his concealed position with his rifle still at the ready. Mackenzie approached the fallen bear cautiously, knowing that wounded grizzlies were capable of sudden bursts of violence even when apparently defeated. But as he drew closer, he could see that the creature's breathing was labored and its eyes had lost their predatory focus. Multiple bullet wounds had finally overcome even its legendary vitality, and Mackenzie realized with something approaching sadness that they were witnessing the death of a magnificent predator. "It's dying," he called back to Miguel. "But we need to get that mare down before she drops her foal on that ledge." The next few minutes passed in a blur of frantic activity. Using ropes from their saddles and the natural climbing skills that came from years of working in mountainous terrain, Mackenzie and Miguel managed to construct a makeshift pulley system that allowed them to lower the mare safely to the canyon floor. She was indeed in active labor, and within an hour of her rescue, she had delivered a healthy colt whose golden coat promised to match his mother's spectacular coloring. It was only after they had both mare and foal safely settled in a sheltered spot away from the dying bear that Mackenzie remembered Crane and his companions. Looking around, he realized that the outlaws had disappeared during the excitement of the bear hunt, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor when faced with two determined lawmen and a rampaging grizzly. "They'll be back," Miguel said quietly, reading his partner's thoughts. "Whatever they're planning with the railroad and the mineral rights, losing one bear isn't going to stop them." Mackenzie nodded, watching as the newborn colt struggled to its feet on impossibly long legs. "Maybe so. But today we saved something worth saving, and sometimes that has to be enough." The bear's breathing had stopped, and the canyon was filled with the kind of silence that only comes after violence has run its course. In the distance, they could hear the sound of approaching riders, but these moved with the measured pace of men who had nothing to hide. Mackenzie recognized the distinctive rhythm of cavalry mounts, probably a patrol from Fort Lowell responding to the sound of gunfire. "Tom," Miguel said, still watching the golden mare nuzzle her newborn foal, "what made you decide to charge that bear?" "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen, and I've seen some crazy things." Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, thinking about wars and memories and the way a man sometimes has to risk everything to save something beautiful. "I guess I got tired of letting things die when I might be able to save them. Sometimes you just have to trust that doing the right thing will work out somehow." As the cavalry patrol rounded the bend and entered the canyon, Mackenzie felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with solving crimes or enforcing laws. They had faced something ancient and terrible and had emerged victorious, not through superior firepower or clever tactics, but through simple determination to protect something innocent and vulnerable. The railroad would come, and Crane would continue his schemes, and there would be other battles to fight in other canyons. But today, in this place where the desert sun painted the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, two lawmen had stood against the darkness and won something worth winning. The mare whickered softly to her colt, and Mackenzie smiled as he watched the young horse take its first tentative steps in a world that was dangerous and beautiful and full of possibilities.